Hello, this is James Paterson. I'm absolutely delighted to be here again with Martin Robinson. Lovely to see you, Martin.
Yeah, and you, James. Nice to see you again.
And just to introduce myself, my background originally was finance. I had a strange career twist into HR and then into internal audit. And for the last 10 years, I've been working, doing training and now increasingly webinars on a range of topics. And during this COVID time, it's been an absolute pleasure to have discussions with Martin and others on a range of interesting topics. Martin, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Martin Robinson. My background was in audit and risk. I spent over 25 years with Lloyd's TSB. Some of my jobs there were head of risk training and head of business audit. Since 2003, I've been an independent consultant, and I specialise particularly in the area of fraud and bribery and corruption. But I've also worked heavily with both the Institute of Internal Auditors and Fraud Advisory Panel. And I'm also a career coach, which I've been doing also for about 15 years. So yeah, welcome to you all, and thank you, James, for our chat today.
Thank you very much. And so what we're going to cover is, and Martin will talk about this in more detail, is why is procurement and outsourcing such a hot topic? We'll give an overview, Martin will give an overview of the whole procurement process, and we'll try to explore in some detail what the key issues might be. I'll talk a little bit about categories and the different sorts of issues associated with different sorts of procurement and outsourcing. We'll talk about the basics that need to be in place. And then we'll also talk about outsourcing and managing third parties, and also where are you aiming for on your journey of trying to get better at procurement. So Martin, do you want to say something about why this is such a hot topic right now?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's really such a huge area to look at. I mean, not only from the point of view of the huge sums of money involved, but also in many ways of making sure you're getting the appropriate value from anything you spend on in the procurement and supply chain and outsourcing. And value is really key. Also, in my experience, it's not very often that procurement professionals are at the executive board level. So from my perspective, often procurement is regarded as a cost center rather than a key strategic venture, even within organizations where procurement is key to their business. The profile of procurement at executive level possibly isn't that great. And also procurement generally from a reporting point of view goes into the finance division. So it's regarded as a cost rather than a value-added proposition. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity, because really the risks involved in managing this area are absolutely huge, because it involves so many different people. But also, as soon as you start involving a supply chain, an outsourcer, you're suddenly heavily reliant on people who don't work for you. So do they actually comply with your sort of approach to ethics and managing risk, etc.? And really, you don't try and optimize these things. And there's so many different examples out there where organizations haven't really managed these things too well. And so really sort of summarizing this area really is the risk is often much higher than people actually appreciate. And actually brainstorming across function is really important to identify potentially what could go wrong in all these areas. Even if you're just buying something like office goods, there's a risk in what you do that as well. So I think it's a really huge area. And if you extend it just beyond procurement to supply chain, outsourcing, etc., it's a mega risk to any sort of organization, really across sector, to be honest, Jane.
I think that's why it's so great to have you here, Martin. I think a couple of things to build on. I think number one is we see so many issues in the newspapers where things don't go as expected. And I often think that many times an issue with a third-party supplier or an outsourcer is actually linked to the root cause of why it goes wrong.
Okay.
So I think one of the key issues why it's so hot is increasingly we're sort of breaking things up to try to manage them. But if you don't match the way you control the supplies and the outsourcing, it could be one of the causes of problems. I think the other brilliant thing that you've said, and I've never really thought about it sufficiently clearly until we started talking about this a little while ago, is I see people being strategic on procurement, as you said, more as, well, let's be strategic so that we can save money, rather than where does this fit into where we're going. And what you also highlighted, Martin, which I think is a great point, is we tend to think simply about, well, if we outsource this and their experienced outsourcers, the problem will be gone. And I think one of the things that I hope Martin and I can communicate as we go through this is really starting to think about the depth of the thinking of the risks as you go through this. And I think, Martin, you'll be fantastic in bringing out some of these issues as we go through. So let's move on and let's talk about the kind of key areas of procurement. And Martin will talk us through that, and I'll make a couple of comments as we go along.
Okay, thank you, James. So what we've got here is a sort of a simplified, if you like, process chart, and starting really from the top, where we look at business requirements, which is where things can really start going wrong from. So you think, oh, that's going to be very straightforward. But linking to what James just said, if you aren't clear totally what you want, and it doesn't link to the overall business strategy, then already at the first hurdle, you've got a problem. And in many ways, a lot of the procurement and outsourcing projects that I've been involved in, it starts going wrong from this, is that we haven't clearly defined not just what we're trying to do, but why we're trying to do it, and what's the business advantage of actually going down this route. So, you know, people often skip this as being a sort of a key risk and control area, but actually it's the most fundamental one. But for most people, whichever sort of function you're in, this means engaging with the executives and senior management, which some people are a bit frightened of. But funnily enough, this is where I've focused some of my risk analysis on, is this first stage. And then as we move round sort of to the right on how do we actually identify what the key risk areas and the categories are, and identifying the right suppliers. Again, a huge area of potential risk to the organization. And I've seen many examples where people make the business requirements so narrow that only one supplier could actually meet that. So, and if you look at it, it looks all very sound, but it looks as though the original supplier was identified up front. So it defeats the whole object of your original, due diligence, if you like. And then evaluating the suppliers' proposals and tenders, which is more the bread and butter, but how does one do it? What does an effective tendering process look like? Make sure you're evaluating the suppliers by financially, operationally, from a quality point of view. Contractual things, that James and I, we could spend all day talking about contracts and how to negotiate contracts and the sorts of things you could look for. But again, a fundamental thing that could go wrong. And then all this is sorted out, and then you're starting to receive the goods and supplies. Are they what you thought they were? Are they the quality they wanted? How are you monitoring all those sort of things? And what about service levels? Are they what you originally contracted? And then after all this whole process, to what extent do you actually reevaluate the whole thing? How's it been for us for this particular project, for this particular procurement? Is there anything we could have done better? And again, that's a huge chunk where people generally ignore. We've learned so much during the whole cycle, and then new people involved in the next procurement stage, and all the learning we've got is lost. So at every stage, clear we could spend time on each of these, but one really needs to think about at each stage what your risks are, and actually debate them across the organization involving different specialist skills. But each one is a fundamental risk for your business, really. So, give you an overview. That's sort of my summary. But James, I'm sure there's something you'd like to add to this for it.
No, it's brilliant. I think the point that you've made about have we implicitly pre-decided who we want is a really, really crucial one. And that can be not necessarily for fraudulent reasons, but we're pretty sure who it ought to be. And I think your point about the evaluation of the suppliers is really great, because it's so easy to evaluate somebody in terms of they're a market leader and they're cheap, and they've given us assurances on certain issues, their IT security, whatever, but not look at, and this has come out very clearly in COVID, okay, yes, but they're based in this location, or they're relying on a supply chain that will take 2 weeks to transport stuff. And there's almost implicit risks, which it's easy to underestimate. You kind of make assumptions. And a little war story that I've got recently, and also it's what are you giving up? So a war story that I've got recently from a client, they outsourced the customer service center to a third party who was a low-cost leader in customer service center. So you'd think that's fine. And these customer service center also had business continuity arrangements. But what happened is during the COVID period, there were not only complaints about the principal, there were also complaints about the customer service center itself and the service it was giving, because they were having interruptions. And suddenly what they realized is there'd been effectively weeks of complaining about the customer service center, but there was nobody in the principal company to receive those complaints. And what was happening is their reputation was starting to tank. So I can't emphasize enough Martin's point about the dimensions of the evaluation, the implicit assumptions you're making, and thinking in terms of risks. Well, if we set them up to be our external face, what if that external face doesn't work properly? How are people going to get back to us and tell us we've got a problem?
Yeah.
And I love the thing as well about the re-evaluations. So often people become attached to the suppliers that they've got. It feels comfortable, and it can then end up being so difficult to really say and to have the evidence to say, but were they actually as good as we wanted them to be?
Right.
Fantastic overview. Any other comments, Martin, before we move on?
Again, really on sort of risk mapping and risk database, does your organization think about your risk management of all this from the point of view of your risk database or your risk analysis to make sure all these risks are being managed throughout the process? So looking strategically risk-wise, I think, is really important. Yeah, brilliant. That's fine. Thanks, Shane.
So in the olden days, when I was in internal audit, it used to be all about strategic supplier management, but that changed during the time that I was head of internal audit into something called category management. Many of the people watching this video may be well familiar with this, but for those of you less familiar, the basic idea is that there are lots of different categories of things that you provide, and there are lots of better or less good suppliers of those categories. And good procurement often is about thinking about the different categories of stuff that you're buying in or that you're outsourcing, and recognizing, back to Martin's point, that the different categories of spend or activity will have different risks related to them. So the obvious thing is recruiting people. You might have a contract with a recruitment company, and employee benefits in terms of healthcare or cars or other things. And then it can go on to who's going to do the canteen in the office and the vending machines, who's going to provide security. And these are all very different kinds of issues if you're trying to evaluate what they're like. You can then go on to, are we going to do our own marketing and advertising, or is somebody else going to do that? And then you can move further on back to kind of employee related. Who's going to do the training and development? Again, is it in-house or is we going to externalize it? Who's going to buy hotel accommodation or travel related expenditure? You might be building a new plant or a new facility. That may involve a contract with a lot of money. You may not be used to doing that. That's a risk area. And also you might not want to build something, you might want to lease it. And that again will have property leasing, its own associated issues. There is more to talk about, but Martin, any comments on these categories before we move on and the kind of issues that can be associated with them?
Yeah, I think as soon as you start looking at these sort of services, if you like, James, you've got a huge number of risks to consider which are different from the point of view of the quality of the service you're getting. And again, more so, it emphasised my point of relying on the person you're dealing with. And just because you've filled a position or you've got a new benefit in, does it actually meet the needs of the business? So again, it's the fact that we're buying it in. So, oh, that's got to be better, has it? Well, no, it hasn't, unless you've actually evaluated what you're trying to get in the first place. So again, I think the most important thing is think about your requirements and try and drop down make it as granular as possible what you're looking for in all these, because even buying something like a marketing service, I mean, that's a huge ask. I mean, what sort of marketing are you looking at? What sort of advertising you look at? What sort of service you want? What sort of reliability? What sort of response? And when you even just start talking about these things, the more specific you can get in the requirements you're looking for, the more likely it is that you're going to be getting what you want with the quality of what you want, with the response you want. So I think what you've raised here is a completely new dimension, James, and not just buying stuff, but buying services, which is a new dimension. It's a new risk area, I think. And each of these, as you say quite rightly, and James, you've got to think about other things that could happen. So I know I totally agree with you.
One thing that you've really just reminded me of is, we'll talk a little bit more about fraud in a minute, and you're an expert in this area, Martin, far more than me. But one of the things that I would say is hidden conflicts of interest.
Right.
So you get somebody to do your marketing and advertising, they're not defrauding you, but they are saying to you, oh, we can do this for you, and it would be a good idea if we did that for you. And although they're not deliberately trying to take money from you dishonestly, they are trying to maximize the amount of business that you do through them.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things to be really aware of. And then the other thing that I'm aware of, and again, let's set aside fraud for a second, is that you set up key performance indicators and you say, I need 95% service on this, I need things to be turned around in this timeline or whatever. And what you'll find that outsourcing and suppliers are good at is they're brilliant at adhering to the letter of your KPIs. But what they're also good at doing is effectively saying, well, you know, I've met your KPIs. The fact that you had 5% difficulty, well, it's in the contract that you can have 5% difficulty. And I think the issue of really thinking through, as Martin said, you know, the requirements in terms of, but if we had 5% of our urgent requests not turned around quickly enough, would that actually be okay? So I think Martin's point about requirements can start to make you look, well, the standard service level agreement might be 95% service requirements, but in some instances, we want that to be 99% or 99.5%, because in this particular situation, it won't be good enough for our reputation just to be operating to the standard key performance indicators.
No, I agree with you, James. And that really leads to, you know, behaviours with all this. And what crossed my mind when you were talking is actually doing the right thing. And when any corporate environment or organisational environment, if people always did the right thing and behaved properly, we wouldn't have any problems with this. But people are people, and it's really manipulating things, which I agree with you isn't necessarily fraudulent. But if it's doing things not to the benefits of the organisation, then I suppose it is fraud, isn't it? But it's back to ethics and culture issue, which maybe another day's discussion. But I think it's a big issue on people doing the right thing all the time. And what I always say is, if it was your business, how would you behave? And that's the thing to always translate. And whether you're in procurement or supply or whatever it might be, is if it was your company, what would you be doing to do the right thing? And if that's the case, you'd never go far wrong. But unfortunately, people never think of it like that. Because why? Because it's not their money they're spending, actually. It's someone else's money. And I think that's always something I always stress to people. Really. Thanks, Jane.
Let's just continue the question of categories. You know, if you're a manufacturing organisation, you'll either be purchasing raw materials, or you'll be purchasing supplies, or intermediate produce things. That's a whole issue. And you get into this whole issue of single source suppliers, critical people, consulting services, which we talked about generally, the utilities question, and then again another common thing is IT. And this starts to get us into, are we just going to buy some IT services, or are we going to fully outsource IT services? So there's a whole range of extent to which you're simply buying something to fully handing over the management of a particular area to somebody else. And we're going to come on to another area in a minute, but anything in terms of the fundamentals that we need in place, anything else to add so far, Martin?
Well, on the outsourcing side, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more, I mean, I think from my perspective, what one needs to think about outsourcing something that works properly and that you understand. And I think in my experience, when an organization tries to outsource something that hasn't got the controls and risk management in place, it's a recipe for total disaster. So, my always recommendation is outsource something you understand that's working okay, and then make sure that you reinforce the controls as soon as it's transferred over. But the idea, which I think we mentioned a bit earlier, about if you outsource something, you've got rid of the problems, actually you're creating more potential risk management issues, really. So that's all I'd like to add to that, James, really.
And in fact, we're going to talk about outsourcing. So I think we can come back to this issue about the pros and cons of outsourcing something that's a bit of a mess versus cleaning up your own mess and outsourcing something tidy. I think that's an important issue. And Martin and I are obviously have a certain expertise in risk and control and auditing. And I thought it'd be useful just to remind ourselves what some of the basic things are that we need. Certainly, I think we would both say that if you're looking to have a good approach to procurement and outsourcing, it's vital that you don't simply have controls and bureaucracy for the sake of controls and bureaucracy. I think one thing that's worth saying just in a short video like this is what you do should be tailored according to the amount of risk that you've got. And again, on the topic of forecasting, you talked about business requirements. I can't stress enough how important it is that you should recognize that, any forecast you have for whatever it is may not be accurate. So how much flexibility have you got there for it not to be quite what you'd originally planned? Otherwise, you can end up committed to get stuff that you don't need. I've written this phrase, which I like, R2A2. It's not something from Star Wars. Responsibilities and accountabilities and authorities and accountabilities, and roles and responsibilities, authorities and accountabilities. And the whole idea here, and I can't stress it enough, is how good is your organization at being crystal clear who does what? You'll very often have a department that wants to purchase something. You may have a purchasing professional. You may also have a manager who's going to be involved in the day-to-day receipt of the service or the product. And if you're not crystal clear on who's doing what, you run such a risk of people saying, oh, I thought somebody else was going to do that. The final point here is you may have very high standards in your organization, but the task of implementing your standards into the third party or the supplier that's providing you cannot be underestimated. It's a whole topic in its own right. What's good practice around how to make sure that the third party is doing what we would like? Any other comments on this, Martin, before we move on to some other areas, including the whole fraud and corruption area?
Well, I think really the policy side is very important. I mean, does your organisation actually have policies over what you're trying to do? And these are things obviously being set and established and communicated by executives. And again, in my experience, sometimes the policies are pretty ropey, and then people wonder why it's all gone wrong. It's because there's been a lack of strategic direction. It's not procedures. Maybe the procedures are okay, but where the guiding policies for what we're trying to do, which have a much greater significant impact than a failure in a policy might have, a failure in a procedure might have. So focusing on policies are really important. So I think that's just reinforces what you're saying, James.
And I think one thing you said about policies and procedures, and we'll come on to that, is you've raised the issue of how aligned are they with where we're going and what are they all about, but also how easy are they to follow. I think that can often be a problem. And then where are the measures to show that they're being followed? So that brings me to monitoring. Whether it's how many hours of consulting have you bought, to did you receive the right number of photocopy paper or whatever. If you don't monitor rigorously what you're buying, there's a huge opportunity to lose value there. And the other thing that's worth saying, I'll hand over to Martin in a second, is very often when you're buying something in, there are all sorts of reasons why you might want to have an exception. We've known them for so long. It's a false exercise to do a proper tender process there. They know us so well, nobody will beat them. Or we're in a rush. It's not practical to go through a whole tendering process right now. And you get this issue of exceptions. And I can't stress enough, based on the work that I've done, and Martin, I'll hand over to you in a second, how easy it is to have exceptions which may have a basis, but to have no visibility of the total number of exceptions that are in place in your organisation and the reasons why these exceptions are being granted. And certainly, if there was one little thing I would always say is, have exceptions, be flexible, but do you know the totality of all the exceptions that you've granted? Martin, any comments on this? And please, some other reflections on the whole corruption and anti-fraud side.
No, I think the points you raise are really, really good. I mean, from a fraud, bribery and corruption point of view, I always regard this area we've been talking about is the hottest area for fraud. And as you know, I follow what's happening in the daily press on the subject all the time because it's my passion, if you like. But every day, really, there's something I read about where there's been a fraud in this area, whether it's just changing payment details or not getting the quality of information or a huge procurement arrangement being intercepted. And what I always talk about when we look at fraud, bribery and corruption, you've got to put a fraudster's hat on, which I think I've used before, that expression. In other words, if you're a fraudster or a cyber criminal or an attacker, looking at the whole supply chain process, how could you manipulate figures? How could you get money? How could you steal materials? How could you manipulate supplies? And it's always worth doing that because if you put the fraudster's hat on, you're in, if you like, in the mind of the fraudster. And throughout the whole process we talked about, the scope for fraud is huge. As you're dealing with people outside, the scope for bribery, given the amount of money involved, is huge. So trying to get a particular contract will be so attractive to organizations, it's worth paying 5% of the contract in the way of a bribe to get that contract. And this is happening globally. And you know, an organization to focus on is an organization called Transparency International, and they actually focus on international bribery and corruption. You'll be horrified globally how this is manipulated. And you look about what's been happening at FIFA, at the Football Federation, over years. You've got bribery and corruption involving all sorts of things in procurement and supply, which has been happening for 25, 30 years now. So here's an organization that does well in the world. It encourages people to play football, etc. And what a dreadful image for young people is the organization that manages this is corrupt. So, you know, I could probably spend all day and all afternoon talking about this, James, but just look at all this stuff with a fraudster's hat on, from both the micro level, the contract level, the management and corruption level. And I think this is one of the biggest areas of fraud. And what I always say to people as well is focus on the weakest link, because that's what the fraudster is going to be doing. They are going to identify the weakest chink in your armor, the weakest part of your supply chain. So if you're in a B2B environment, they're not going to attack your organization, but they're going to attack the links between you and one of the suppliers or the supplier's supplier, etc. And that's their way in. So again, go through rigorously the process. If you're a fraudster, how could you get in? How could you manipulate? How you could gain advantage? how you could gain money, and then you won't go far wrong. But this is a really, really time-consuming thing, and people don't really want to look at fraud if they're trying to sign a contract or do a procurement deal. This isn't on their agenda, and it's probably not on their risk radar either. So even if you encourage people doing these things to think about fraud, then I think you've made a huge gain to the process, because often the F word isn't mentioned at all when you look at these sort of things, because contracts are to be signed. And that's, I think, the biggest issue, James. Really.
I think a couple of things linked to what you're saying is so interesting. I think your weakest link point is excellent in relation to this. And I've seen clients who've let something go, and you can almost see that the criminal networks are then going around and telling everybody they're an easy touch. So they find the frequency of something increases. And, you know, if somebody watching this is either a head of procurement or a CFO, CEO, audit committee chair, one thing I would say, and it links a little bit to the conflict of interest, is forgive me, but people who run purchasing and procurement processes and outsourcing processes, they can be quite attached to these processes. So you'd be surprised when you say, you know, is there a fraud risk associated with your procurement process? They'll say, oh no, it's best in class and all that kind of thing.
That's it.
You go in with a kind of mindset that Martin's got. Martin's got more experience than me. I'm not going to put myself forward on this. And get somebody to think of it from the perspective of the fraudster. You'll get a totally different perception of what the risks in these lovely, neat processes and procedures are. I can't stress enough. The question I'd be asking a head of procurement about this is, when is the last time somebody independent pressure tested your fraud risk assessment? I think the other thing that I would say is, and this is, you know, unfortunately, we're in a complicated world, is, you know, bribery, fraud and corruption doesn't happen. I mean, because there's lots of very tough rules about this now, and often tough, complicated policies that companies have. It's through the intermediary. So we can demonstrate absolutely definitively up to the boundary of our company that we're clean, but we're paying this service level or this commission to somebody else. And the question of, do you know what's happening to the money they're spending? And also the other thing I'd say is indirect favours. So money's being given to a charity, a favour is being given to a family member. It could be a job, it could be a holiday home. Back to Martin's point, please don't think nowadays that this is just straightforward, a wad of cash. No. The other thing that's worth saying, thinking about wads of cash, is something I've seen is organisations that might sell second-hand photocopiers or second-hand equipment, and the sale is done through cash. And so there's a whole pool of cash that isn't anywhere officially in the accounting records. So what the company does is write off the second-hand stuff. But the question again then is, when was this appraised for value? Did it really just get scrapped? What happened to it? Because I've seen, again, money leaking out indirectly through stuff that's written off that isn't really worthless.
Right, I agree. No problem. Yeah, I agree with you.
So let's just quickly talk about outsourcing and managing third parties. And this is obviously a little bit more involved than what Martin talked to when he talked about managing your suppliers, because you might need to go, because you're going to have this IT supplier or this manufacturing facility for the next 3 years in a contract. You really will need to get into more due diligence on who they really are. The contract and the service level agreements will be typically in more depth. And then you're going to have a whole thing about taking what we've got and giving it to the outsourced provider. This is no longer just buying something new. This is actually moving something out. So the issue that Martin talked about is, are we transitioning a mess to the outsourced provider, or are we transitioning something clean? And again, there's a huge opportunity for, if you're not clear what you've got, kind of passing over some of it and then finding yourself in a situation where in the small print of the contract you've agreed, you're suddenly in for a bigger cost because the outsourced provider can point out that what you've done isn't quite what you said you'd do.
Yeah.
And then I think the other things to say are all around the measurement of the outsourced provider. I mean, if it's a really key outsourced provider, an IT, you'll be monitoring what they're doing on a daily basis. You'll be having weekly or even daily phone calls with them about their service levels. And inevitably, you've got to think about how do you get assurance over what they're doing, because ultimately, you're going to have to decide whether we're going to keep going with this outsourced provider or move on to somebody else. And again, all too often, we leave that decision to too late. So we end up rolling over the contract rather than really having the time to think about whether we're going to do it to somebody else. Right. That's a quick gallop through that process. But any particular points you'd like to highlight, Martin?
Well, I think that they're great points. And what I particularly stress is the people side again, and the expertise. It's because often when you outsource, you may be outsourcing some of the staff you currently have, and with the expectation that those people are going to carry on working on your contract ad infinitum. But what often happens, if they're good, the outsourcer that takes on responsibility will probably move your good people onto other contracts. So what I'd stress, I mean, all these things are really sort of detailed, but what I'd really stress is make sure you look at your expertise, and also in the contract, make sure you're going to have access to that expertise once it's been outsourced across. And the other thing I've stressed, looking since we've been talking, James, is go back to behaviours. Are you dealing with an organisation that you really trust, that's actually going to comply with your sort of way of doing things, that's going to be as ethical as you, is going to take data protection as serious as you, and data governance as good as you, but also things like fraud and whistleblowing. To what extent do they comply, or will they comply with your way of doing things? And in my experience, those things I've just covered are often completely ignored. And then they wonder why, when the outsourcing is gone, weird things start happening, because they haven't actually investigated enough some of these much softer issues. So I wouldn't necessarily say these outweighed some of the things you've discussed, James, but they must be a complementary discussion. Otherwise, they could bring down the success of any outsourcing arrangement, I think, James.
Well, I think you've raised some brilliant points, and I'd just like to build on a couple of them because I think they're really great. This issue about the people that you've outsourced and the retention of those is a great one. And what that makes me think is, you know, you may have agreed that they will stay on your contract for the next 12 months, but there's every chance, as you said, Martin, that if they're really good, they'll be gone after 12 months. So the issues, I mean, don't underestimate how rapidly somebody who's left your organisation can change their loyalties. Yeah. I think the other issue that you highlighted, which is brilliant, you're making it clearer for me as well, and I hope the people that are watching this, is you outsource a bundle of people, and the danger is, have you literally outsourced everybody who knows about this area? Because there's a huge argument to be said. Outsource 19 of the 20, but keep arguably the best one of the 20 to be your point person to manage the rest of them. But it's so tempting to go, we'll just outsource the lot. So I think the issue of who is really going to lead this contract, and, you know, if there was a manager of a team, why shouldn't that person, especially if they understand the detail, stay on your side?
Right.
And then the other thing I'd say, linked to kind of the assurances and the behavior, and I've seen this with one of my clients, is I've got a third-party outsource provider that I've worked for. And not only do they provide the right to audit, you'll have heard this phrase 100 times, they even offer their own internal audit reports to the clients that they work for. Now, there's a selfish side to that, which is I'd rather let you see our internal audit reports so that, for example, I don't get a visit from one client, and then another client, and then another
Yeah.
client in terms of being audited. But I think, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute, but I think this issue of, do you feel that your outsourced provider has the right cultural attitude towards you is really, really important.
Definitely, definitely.
So again, I can't stress enough, linked to what Martin was saying, that thinking in risk terms is so important, and that goes beyond just the what does the policies and procedures say to how do we think that they're behaving. And then finally, I think this is the final slide. I think one thing when Martin and I were talking about this that we want to convey to you, and again, some will be very familiar with this, so hopefully this is a useful reminder. For some, this might be new, is there's a whole journey to go on, and there's a whole decision. Martin talked about this before, about where do you want to get to. So for some organisations, you know, you want basic procurement activities to be in place, obvious and automatic control and compliance activities, and that's fine. But for some organisations, be they bigger or particular areas, you want a more sophisticated approach to the procurement and to the anti-fraud, because actually there's more at stake, this matters more. And then finally, when you get to the biggest organisations, you really want, as Martin touched upon, for procurement to be absolutely part and parcel of the strategic conversation. And again, I think Martin's reminder to us, how close is the head of procurement and the key procurement choices and outsourcing to the board and C-suite level conversation is really important. And Martin, any builds on this issue about the fact that it's a whole journey that we might go on with choices that we need to make as we go through it as an organisation?
I mean, sort of linked to that, but I mean, what we haven't talked about at all, probably, James, is controls. And I think the controls are very important as you go up the process as well. I know we've majored on, you know, strategy and risks and policies. This is sort of an area where tight controls is really important, whatever level you're talking about. And, you know, the fact that many organizations are delayered now and controls have disappeared because they're not supposed to be workable. No one's checking the controls. Please don't forget the importance of controls in this area, because often I find problems in this area are actually significantly reduced by having sound business controls in place. The typical sort of things of segregation of duties, trail, authorization, management review, supervision are so important as you work up this ladder. So please don't ignore those. And controls are so important. So don't suddenly think it's only the risk stuff, it's the detailed stuff that's also so relevant, because what can start as a little fraud, a little error, can suddenly mushroom to something which could be business destroying. So, you know, I accept all these things, but don't lose track of your controls, really, whatever function you work in. Yeah, that's all I'd really want to add, James.
Well, no, it's a great point. And just sort of, again, what you've triggered me to think, Martin, is this, that most organisations should have controls. And you would like to think that the controls over the £1,000 a year spent on photocopy paper will be different from the controls spent on the 50,000 a year on IT. Right. So there's a question of, again, the risk-based. But the issue of, as you said, Martin, can you just confirm that these aspects, segregation of duties, authorities, are recognised as key controls in the organisation? And as key controls in the organisation, is there a zero tolerance approach to them not operating? Would we know if there was an important issue where segregation of duties are not in place, and not purely relying on the internal auditor to do that? So I think your point about controls and minimum standards, and how would I know, and how quickly would I know that that wasn't done? Because I think one of the fundamental things, and Martin, be interesting to get your kind of concluding remarks on that, is, you know, Martin and I come both from a kind of risk and audit perspective, but it's like, don't think that the auditors or the procurement function is going to save you for problems in this area. There's a real issue of who owns this. So any kind of final concluding remarks on this, Martin?
No, I think ownership is key, and I think it's got to be, you've got to overlap rather than underlap, and I think that's the key issue, James. Now, I think it's a point rightly made that if you're the people who are responsible for buying something or taking delivery, you have ownership. It's no one's else to risk manage, and I think the more that our organisations overlap the controls rather than underlap, can only lead to better success and less risk, to be honest. So, no, I agree, and that's really my final comment, really, James. Yeah, thank you.
So look, Martin, this is the second of the videos that we've done. We've done another video, if people haven't seen it, on fraud together. And certainly, if people would like to get in touch with me, my website's below, and with Martin, and we've had contacts as a result of some of the other videos that we've done, get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with Martin as well.
Right.
So on that final comment, Martin, thanks again so much.
Thanks very much.
Take care.
Thanks, James.